were bribed with, and how significant that amount of money was in
Yes, that
1940?
was a huge amount of money. Morris, you got to break it down. It's over $4,000 per person that each delegate got. $4,000 would have bought a big house in the suburbs in that day and age. I mean, the house that Dick and I grew up here in Glens Falls, it's a 3-bedroom house with a 180-foot lot. They paid $1,500 for it in 1940.
Yeah.
So it gives you a sense of what $4,000 was. It was a lot of money. A brand new Packard, which is probably the best car being made in the country, cost about $1,100. So you're talking about the price of 3 or 4 Packards. It's a lot of money. Yeah, a lot of money. So it's yeah.
This is kind of on the silly side, but was the name of the character Daisy an allusion to another novel?
Yeah, it sort of is. I couldn't resist that. She was this. She's sort of part of the way through. She's this unattainable sort of figure, but then it sort of changes. I don't want to get into it. I don't want to ruin it again, but yeah,
Okay.
it has sort of an overtone of that. Yeah, Hawkins is he's an average sort of guy. He's not wealthy, and he was a valve salesman, and that's how he got into all of this. And basically, because he was on the continent a lot, and he saw what was going on. So he certainly does not come from this aristocratic milieu, but he comes over here and he's Anglo-American, so he's got a kind of plummy kind of accent because he's not, the British think he sounds very American. The Americans all think he sounds very English. In fact, he's neither. He's transatlantic is what he is, but he's sort of, and he's a man who doesn't really fit in anywhere. And so he's sort of an outsider and a striver. And, Daisy represents something he's striving towards. Yeah. Anybody else? Deb?
Larry, when your vision for just that scene, how did you research that? Where did you pull all the parts? Pat and Dick's?
Some of that, yeah. I should say my brother and sister-in-law are early American culture experts. They're certified personal property appraisers, and they actually wrote they're right down here, right in front here. They wrote the appraisal, the certification exam for early American furniture, which everybody who wants to be certified in that have to take. So it gives you a sense of expertise. So yeah, I learned a lot from them. I did, yeah.
But you didn't go up and down North Broadway, house to house?
Oh no, I didn't go house to house. You can drive up and down, but the house North Broadway was developed in the 19th century, so it's not that old. Yeah. Doug?
When did that Pennsylvania bribery thing come to light? What year did that? And how did that surface? What?
I found out about it from an article in the New York Times, reporting on Gerhard Weinberg, and that was 1998. That surfaced.
So that's when it became public that this had occurred.
That this had occurred, right?
Wow.
Right. The earlier versions of that aspect of the story weren't in the earlier versions of the book. So that was something that came through a rewrite, and I think it was, who knows? I'm certain it was a lot more. And given the state of the captured German archives, which is very sad, but we'll probably never know because they're just, there aren't enough researchers and professors and graduate students to go through those gigantic archives and dig out part of it. And also, too, I mean, there was also a lot was lost at the end of the war. British Security Coordination's archives were deliberately destroyed at the end of the war. There were several semi-trucks were taken out and were burned out of the offices. They got rid of everything. A lot of the records of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service, there was a communications center in Hamburg. It was hit by bombs and was wiped out. All the records were lost. So we don't know fully what happened. I suspect the British probably had some better idea than anybody, and they won't talk. They won't acknowledge anything, even to this day. And for instance, like the role of William Stevenson, who a lot of people think was actually more or less the Supreme Allied Commander for Intelligence. When Stevenson died in 1989, President George H.W. Bush, the first one, sent a missing man flyover formation of U-2 spy planes to his funeral.
Wow.
Now think about that for a minute. For one thing, a U-2 is not an easy plane to fly, and it's not very maneuverable. To do a missing man formation would have been hard, and they use fighters, U-2s. They've never done it before, they've never done it since. So that tells you something. I mean, Bush sent U-2 spy planes to his funeral. I mean, The British probably know a lot more to say even to this day, but they'll never talk. if the records even exist themselves anymore. Like British security coordination's records, they may have been destroyed generations ago.
From my reading, the Russians hoovered up a good bit of that German intelligence.
They probably did. We don't know what they got though, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously. Yeah. So, yeah, it's quite a story. It's quite a story. It is. Anybody else? Yeah.
It's interesting that your publisher stepped things up when Mr. Donald Trump decided to be a candidate for the presidency. And so I wanted to ask you, like there's something that's come into the news just in the last 24 hours that indeed Donald Trump did consider firing Mueller last June. That's today's news.
Right.
And so now there's a real concern about what will happen. What will happen in the Congress? What will happen among the electorate? What will happen with the people in this room? What will we do if that happens? And because he has the authority to do that, are there parallels, specific parallels like that, that align your story? Because what's happening today is so bizarre, and it seems like it's already happened before.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that alignment?
Yeah, I think there is a considerable alignment. I mean, I think it's pretty clear already that the Russians did intervene in a big way in the 2016 election. I don't think, I think it's the question of probabilities is the way really to look at it. The probability that the Russians intervened is, I think that's settled. How far that went is not so clear. For instance, did they actually interfere with the count? There's reason to believe they might have. I mean, they broke into the election systems of 21 states, and they broke into the computers of the companies that make the voting machines. About 30% of the United States vote on what are called direct entry voting machines. That is, to say there's no paper records. Who knows? I sort of framed the issue this way, as far as that goes. I mean, a little thought exercise. Suppose someone breaks into your apartment. What happens? Do they look around, walk around, look around, say, "Oh, this is cool, I'm in an apartment," and they leave? Or do they spray paint tags on your walls, break your furniture, steal your stuff? You know, they don't. They're sort of saying they don't do that, and they don't even use the toilet or steal a beer out of your fridge. They just look around and say, "Oh, this is cool, oh, I'm in the house," and then they leave. Or alternatively, they break into your car, and they sit in the front seat of the car and say, "Oh, this is cool, I'm in the car," but they don't drive the car anywhere. I think we're all grown-ups here. We know that, you know, people break into your apartment, bad things are going to happen. People steal your car. It's probably going to wind up, you know, in a ditch someplace. Probably. Yeah, I mean, it's just common sense. So it's kind of weird to say that they got into it, but didn't do anything. Maybe. But what's the probability? That's why I say a lot of this goes to probabilities. We don't know. So I think, you know, this investigation is going to go on for longer than I think people expect. There's months left to go, because I think there's a lot more to unravel. People are looking like, oh, maybe this will wrap up in a month or two. We'll see. We could go into the summer, actually. Who knows how big the whole thing is. So it's hard to say. I think it's definitely going to impact the next election in ways we can't predict. But I think it's a massive story. How big a role the Trump people played, were they conspiring actively, or are they just incompetent? Who knows? You know, and stumbling around and not realizing how dangerous the things that they were and talking to the Russians. We don't know. That will come out. So I think people, you know, I know a lot of people will say, well, if he's Trump, let the process play its way out. We'll see where it goes. We have to trust the process. We have to trust the rule of law. And I think it'd actually be very tough. It might be disputed in court his ability to fire Mueller. We don't know. You know, possibly not. Yeah.
Larry, can you talk a bit about, I mean, sort of, I know this because I'm interested in this era of history, but during 1940, Roosevelt was kind of secretly, surreptitiously giving some help to Britain, and if it ever came out, he could have faced impeachment. And so, you know, obviously him helping Britain unofficially off the book, so to speak, was vital to Britain staying, you know, and before Lend-Lease even. So the significance of Roosevelt not being reelected, can you sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it would have been huge. In the summer of 1940, it was unclear how, you know, Roosevelt wasn't doing very much at that point, because I think for one thing, the British had to survive the Battle of Britain. They had to get through that first, because a lot of people thought, and basically the military was saying, Joint Chiefs were saying, you know, if we help Britain and we give them any of our stuff, it'll just fall into the hands of the Nazis. We shouldn't do this. I mean, there was a parallel to that. when France fell, Churchill wanted the Air Force, Royal Air Force, to go all in to try and save France. And Hugh Downing, Chief Air Marshal of the Royal Air Force, said no. He refused to do it. And Churchill was enraged, almost fired him. He did fire him after the Battle of Britain was over, just out of pipe. Downing, of course, was completely right. They would have thrown the planes away for nothing, and the planes that Downing saved Britain and saved civilization. I mean, he really was the man who sort of saved Western civilization, actually. I mean, he doesn't get the credit he deserves. He does have a nice spot in Westminster Abbey, but but he's not. He's like, you know, he belongs on the column. There's an empty column in Trafalgar Square, and he belongs on the top of it. But the parallel to that, you see, they were afraid if we gave all this stuff to Britain, it would just fall into Nazi hands. Roosevelt proposed a deal in the summer of 1940 to give Britain 40 surplus World War I destroyers in exchange for islands in the Caribbean and bases, places like Jamaica and Bermuda and so on. And there was a tremendous resistance to it. People say that this is going to wind up in the hands of the Nazis. What's the point of this? And there was a huge fight over this. They eventually did pass it. It was very dicey for a long time. There wasn't a lot of help in 1940, in the summer of 1940. It began to unravel more and more as it went along. When it really actually caught steam was after the election. The election was a very bitter election, actually. Roosevelt was running against Wendell Willkie, and the Republicans assumed that he would be totally reverse everything that Roosevelt did. Willkie was the president of the Southern Company, which was a giant holding company that owned the electric utilities that TVA took over. And it was really no one before the war who was more really anti-Roosevelt and anti-New Deal than Willkie. But when Willkie got into basically started running for office and he got briefings on what was going on, he sort of realized the situation, in fact, internationally was really, really scary. And after the election was over, and he ran on an isolationist platform, he really attacked Roosevelt in an awful sort of way. I mean, there was campaign slogans and signs that Roosevelt meant dictatorship and war, and this was really awful. It was an ugly campaign. But after it was over, he flipped over, and he did so fairly quickly, and began basing Roosevelt's international policies. Basically, the Lend-Lease bill passed that winter because Willkie came out in support of it and began calling Republican congressmen saying, "Look, you got to support this bill." And that's how it passed. And it might not have passed without Willkie's support. The draft bill was passed that year. It was a year later. It was renewed by a single vote. I mean, that's how close it all was. So there was a tremendous resistance to the U.S. getting involved, and a tremendous fear of what it was going to mean. But you know, sure. I mean, wars are scary. They can bring in a lot of changes in society that you don't want. As Lincoln said, no war ever left a country where it found it. It's true. But the international danger from what the Germans were doing was so much greater that it overweighed any other consideration. So it was a horrible problem, an incredibly tough problem that Roosevelt faced in the summer of 1940. Really, really bad. So, yeah, no, please.
This book dovetails with The Darkest Hour, the movie that just came out about this period.
Yes.
Precisely.
The Battle of Britain is going on while the story takes place, literally on a day-by-day basis. So, since The Darkest Hour is the background to the story, it doesn't hear too much in the story about the Battle of Britain, but it is going on, and you see a few things in reference to it in the story. All right. Anybody else have any other questions? Or?
Larry, I just want to make a comment. I'm sitting here listening to the questions, and so many people in this room know that timing is everything in politics. I got to say, timing is everything with this book.
It is. I absolutely have to agree. It's an astonishing thing how there's some kind of grand Jungian synchronicity or collective cosmic consciousness or the will of God, whatever it is. It's just somehow, I do think at moments somehow I in this book was saved for this moment. I don't know. It's kind of weird. I have to tell you, it's kind of weird. It is, but it's coming out, and it's just coming out when all the stuff is peaking. I mean, you can't plan it. You can't plan it. You couldn't. Yeah. Patrick?
Did you keep the film rights?
Yes, we did.
Good question.
Oh yes, no, we kept the film rights, and my agent is going to be. That's the next job for my agent. He's going to be doing it. They're waiting for sales numbers, and then they're going to try and sell it. Maybe the motion pictures or television miniseries. I've actually I took film classes when I was at NYU, and I know how to write screenplays. I've done a complete screenplay of the story. And I've also done a television pilot, like a miniseries.